Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Rory Williams. I'm the director of winemaking and viticulture at Frog Sleep Winery down in the Napa Valley, which for all the Oregon guys out there, that is a region in California, which is a state just to your south. We farm about 200 acres in Napa. So we're one of the pioneers of organic farming in Napa. So we've certified our first vineyard in 1989. And we've been dry farming ever since the early 90s. And so we now dry farm about 190 acres, 200 acres of grapes in Napa Valley, and kind of help, together with one other winery, kind of guide the conversation on dry farming, on farming without irrigation, and all of the inlaid strategies and techniques and attitudes required to get that. Well, in terms of how to define like a successful vintage, a successful, dry farming operation in Napa, there's the pretty obvious, practical eventuality of dry farming, which is get your grapes ripe and don't have them get blown out. That always helps in terms of staying in business and making great wine. But for me, it's how you got to get there with dry farming. At least in California, it's if you go into it with the attitude of, oh, I'm not going to do this, or I'm not going to do that, I'm not going to irrigate my grapevines. That's a way of ticking the box and saying that you dry farm, but it's not really the way to actively dry farm. I consider it a verb, not a status to be achieved. And so how are you preparing your grapevines to resist and be resilient to the vagrancies of any particular year? And that's way different to use a couple of recent examples, it's way different for a 2021 when we got 13 inches of rain. It stopped in February. It was extremely dry. How is that same grapevine needs to be responded to that versus a 2017 when we got 75 inches of rain and then it got super hot. And so you have all these kinds of, not that any grower in Oregon is unfamiliar with these kinds of chances that can befall an agricultural operation. You might feel that, or sometimes I think the interpretation is that we ride a little bit more on the edge in Napa, and maybe that's the case. We don't get rain in the summer, and so it's a different project than it is for the Bordelais or the Burgundians or a Willamette Valley grower. But the goal is the same. How do you achieve a resilient grapevine that gives me a terroir expressive, gives me something that's beautiful and delicious and economically sustainable, and has the ability to capture what I think is the whole point of wine, which is this ability to transmit time and place. Dry farming helps with that, and that's why we do it. It helps us make better wine in the long run, both through the strength of our vines and for the actual wines that come out of it. So in terms of like factors that go into it, as you might expect, it's not just about going out there and turning off the water. That's a great way to kill a grapevine in Napa. If the vine has not been prepared to expect a normal that involves no water at all for several months. We just got this is November 11th today that I'm talking. We just got our first rain today since April down in Napa. So it's this long-term project of how do you build something that's resilient? There are tons of factors that go into that. Rootstock choice is the least sexy and maybe most important choice that a vineyard manager can make. Are you using something that is vigor reducing, which is a nice way of saying not drought resistant in Napa, and is therefore going to be more dependent upon water coming in and feeding that soil over the course of the growing season? Or are you doing what we're doing and using a much more vigorous, much more drought-resistant rootstock, such as, for us, it'd be St. George or 110R, but there are numerous others that are capable of, that have evolved to not expect water during the summer. So these are species of native grapevines, the rupestris, the berlandieris, that come not from stream banks in the northeast of the United States, but come from South Texas, Chihuahua, come from the Ozarks, areas where you're not getting these heavy summer rains, and therefore are your ally really in terms of how to prepare a grapevine not to expect water. In Napa, the project is never, or at least in my mind, is never, can I get my grapes ripe? Yes, I will always get my grapes ripe. It's warm enough, it's dry enough that that's never really the issue in question. The issue in question is, can I get them there while preserving acidity, preserving freshness? And dry farming really helps us achieve that at the same time. That goes hand in hand with how to protect grapes, space them widely, give them lots of room to grow, allow for shade on the grapes. Don't be afraid of it. This is not Bordeaux. We're not trying to maximize ripeness at every turn. And so in a lot of ways, the project and therefore the approach to how you farm, how you make these little decisions over spacing and rootstock, building up soil health is a huge part of that. So we use a heavy cover cropping system. We spread compost in all of our vineyards every year. Why? Because when that decomposes and becomes part of the soil, it becomes soil organic matter. It becomes this glue between particles of soil that, when inverted into the soil, becomes a sponge. It allows us to trap all that winter rain and make it such so that the fine root hairs of the vines, as they grow through the summer, can mine those little bits of water that are trapped between the clay particle and the sand particle. The only way to trap that water is to have the glue active, have active microflora in the soil that build these connections in the soil. Cover crops are a huge part of that. And so dry farming I see as this thing, it's not about what you're not doing, it's about what are you doing? What factors are you maximizing to give yourself the best chance of getting something that can make it through a whole summer on no additional water. In terms of factors, site selection is very important for what cultivar, so what grape variety you're looking to plant in that area. In terms of whether or not you're able to dry farm it, I think, especially in Napa, there's a misconception that it has to be super deep, super rich soil with a high water table or something in order to dry farm it. And that is absolutely not the case. We dry farm everything between rocky hillside soil all the way down to deep river soils with tons of gravel, all the way through to stuff like Maxwell clay, which for those not initiated is a heavy, gooey, almost anaerobic, very root limiting soil in sections of our vineyard. We can dry farm all of it with correct rootstock selection and especially cultivar selection. These different soils are going to be best adapted to different varieties. So something like these serpentine Maxwell clays, which are very limiting to nutrient and water status later in the summer. So by September, October, they're dried out. They're not able to give nutrition to vines. Well, that's a problem if you've planted Cabernet in there and the Cabernet is not ripe yet. And that's when you have to drip in water and nutrients via these fertigation setups. If you'd made your cultivar choice correctly and picked Sauvignon Blanc or Chenin Blanc or something a little earlier ripening, they get there, they get over the goal line, they have enough energy left in their systems to shut down and go dormant for winter, and they're good to go. That's a huge economic choice in Napa because you can make a lot, especially in Napa, you can make a lot more money growing bad Cabernet than you can growing great Sauvignon Blanc. But as a farmer, this is the choice you make, to either endeavor to make something that's really beautiful and expressive of sight or not. Grapes, so in terms of like whether or not we have access to water, it's rarely an issue in Napa. Napa's during the rainy season, Napa's fairly abundant with water. Our average rainfall is about 30 inches. That's quite a bit for California, outside of the far northern areas like Humboldt and Mendo. But compared to someplace like Paso Robles, which gets 12 to 15 inches of rain every year, or especially compared to an almond grower in Fresno, who needs tons of water and has no groundwater sources, has no reservoir, gets very little natural rainfall during the winter. That's a whole different ballgame. And I would say for grapes, at least on the north coast of California, it's rarely a question of water distribution rights and things like that. So no, it's not because we didn't have water. It's because the earliest farming pioneers in Napa, which came in the 1840s, 1850s, usually Missouri settlers, remarked, and they have these beautiful agricultural journals going back, and UC Davis, I believe, has a lot of these, and the UC Berkeley Library has a lot of these on record, where they remarked at just how easy it was to dry farm wheat in Napa Valley. So the knowledge has been around a really, really long time, and it turns out that while I suppose wheat could be terroir expressive as well, wine's a particularly good medium for that kind of expression. And so this ability to capture what it means to taste like a place, taste for me like home, is not unique to wine. Chocolate, coffee, tea, beer, spirits can do all this too. Wine is, for me, my favorite way of doing it. Yeah, so in terms of like ground management, hot topic in Napa these days for sure, and just part of the perennial decision-making process. We spread compost after harvest, broadcast it with a manure spreader at the tune of about 2 to 4 tons per acre. This is after harvest, and it's more as this kind of maintenance spreading of compost. It's not so much like a direct attempt to directly fertilize, but instead that's a compost that gets into the soil and helps build soil structure, builds those networks that I was talking about that enable it to trap water. Heavy cover cropping, so usually about 60% legumes of various kinds, fabas, vetch, peas, along with some mass builders, so things like triticale wheat, oats, cayuse oats. In heavier soils, we'll use things like daikon radish. And in certain blocks that I leave up for a longer period in the spring before we mow them down, we'll use things like lacy phacelia or crimson clover, which bloom late into the season, provide great beneficial habitat for native insects and things like that. We do mow that down in the spring. Traditionally, we've always disced it and tilled it in and managed under vine with what's a French hoe plow. So it's this kind of hydraulically loaded plow that swings underneath the vine and then swings back to remove the cover crop that's growing under vine. And that's our primary weed control. I'm experimenting with some no-till blocks. Just mowing it at the moment, for me, it's an active area of interest in terms of, okay, if we're not going to define organics as simply not spraying, and if we're not going to define dry farming as simply not irrigating, I have a sense that I would like to not define no-till agriculture as simply not tilling. It's an active area of research of, okay, what am I doing to enable my vines to not have too much competition for water during the summer months. I've observed it be a killer for vines to have that competition in the summer months. So a permanently growing green sward is not an option. So what do you do? Is it roller crimping? Okay, what kind of cover crops do you plant to enable perfect kill in a roller crimping setup? What are you doing under vine? Is it a lazy, slow, flail mower that you can kind of let guide under there? Is it a weed eater? Because that's messy and dirty and very time consuming. So this is where I'm still trying to figure out solutions and don't have all the answers. Gotta be honest. Yeah, I mean, in terms of like ideal soil types for dry farming, I believe that the band that you can dry farm in, especially in Napa, is very wide. Between heavy clay soils all the way up to very rocky, sandy soils. There are extremes on either end of that become very difficult. When they get so wet and so impermeable to water that they are actually federally protected wetland, probably not that good for grapes, period. Better for hay or egrets. Or if you get into the really, truly crazy steep stuff where there's just no topsoil at all, yeah, those things are going to have to be force-fed some water and nutrients to make it over the goal line. I would prefer to plant, I'd prefer to keep it as natural wetland in the former case, and I suppose I prefer to keep it as oaks and manzanita and the occasional olive in the latter case. We grow grapes in the middle band, and we are able to dry farm everything we do. In terms of again, how to measure success with it, there's a certain amount of okay, do these grapes ever get ripe on this soil? If they don't, then it could be a dry farming problem, but it's more likely a cultivar or rootstock selection problem, a basic issue of viticulture, rather than it being dry farming specific. In terms of do I see certain blocks be more successful than others? I do, and that's just because grape blocks tend to be very sensitive and very different on their own, and they tend to respond well to different kinds of years. So in extremely hot years that are at the end of a drought year. So we'll shout out 2022 as an example of this, where you have this end of a drought, 3-year drought series. The vines are honestly just a little bit tired of drought, as are all the humans, to be quite honest. And then you get this crazy heat wave during harvest, and the vines that are on these very gravelly, very sandy soils without a whole lot of extra water to tap into, they suffered. And they lost some of their subtlety. They weren't as successful that year, versus the vines that were planted in slightly heavier soils, a little bit more clay in there, a little bit more silt. They tended to have a little bit more to draw on and respond to that craziness in a more balanced, a fresher way. But then you flip it on its head. In 2023, we get plenty of rain, and those gravelly soils are what evolve into something that's just beautiful and exotic and incredibly successful, I guess you would say. And the stuff on clay is also delicious, but it lacks some of the extra, pizzazz that some of those great gravelly, sandy soils do. And so in the end, dry farming helps you hopefully get to where you wanted to go in the first place, which is have something that's responsive to year, that's responsive to the individual conditions, without wetting the bed. These grapes all become ripe. We don't lose any crop, but their range of how you define success gets pretty subtle, I would say, other than if you just, suck at grape growing and have a field failure due to mildew or something. But that's usually not dry farming's fault.